Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, NGA Vice Chairman, Governor Steve Bullock. Governors of the United States of America, my Trade Minister, Steve Ciobo, our Australian Premiers and Chief Ministers, our Ambassador Joe Hockey, Chief Executive of the NGA, Scott Patterson, friends, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honour for me to be here at the heart of the American Federation. I want to thank you for your hospitality as we thank President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump for the very warm welcome and hospitality accorded Lucy and me during our visit here. Now, both our countries are federations, and indeed our federation and our constitution were in no small measure inspired by yours. It's why some political scientists describe our system of government, which is a parliamentary system, as you know, as being Washminster, a combination of Washington and Westminster. It works very well, but as I said to some of you last night, I don't know whether this is true here, but complaining about the Australian Federation is like complaining about Switzerland's mountains. We work with it. And we're joined by our counterparts, your counterparts, the premiers and chief ministers of our states and territories. Now, our two nations are federations of great states, and each is so much greater than the sum of the parts. As it says on the Great Seal of the United States, on the scroll carried in the beak of the American eagle, a pluribus unum, out of many one. And looking around the room, I'm struck by the sheer diversity of ties that bind our two countries. Governor Herbert of Utah, where an Australian mining company, Rio Tinto, Kennecott's Bingham Canyon mine, has generated more exports, income and employment than any other private sector operation. And Chairman Sandoval, in your state, Australian graduates are setting up an unmanned aerial vehicle delivery service through a company called Flirty, working with the University of Nevada. They've made the first regulator-approved deliveries of emergency medical supplies and retail goods for 7-Eleven, and I'm told they're working with NASA to sort out the details of air traffic control. Now, as you said, Governor, our relationship as proud and independent federations really came of age 100 years ago on the battlefields of the Western Front in World War I. You can read in the letters and diaries of our battle-hardened soldiers, our diggers, how they marvelled at the arrival of the Sammies, as they called them, with their enthusiastic faces and extraordinary-looking equipment. And your Sammies did not take long to win respect and admiration from the Australians. They fought their first true offensive together with Australian troops, the Battle of Le Hamel. At the time, this was arguably the most sophisticated joint operation in history, involving airdrops, artillery, and a line of British tanks. It was the first time American soldiers had served under foreign command in an offensive operation, and under the leadership of our greatest general, John Monash. Monash planned for them to take the village of Hamel in 90 minutes. They did it in 93 minutes. And he chose the 4th of July to do it. America's decisive intervention in the Great War marked its arrival as a global superpower with both moral and realist global interests. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed this was the war to make the world safe for democracy, a doctrine of principled realism. The Battle of Hamel was a turning point that put the German army on the defensive right up until Armistice Day, and for our two nations, it was the beginning of 100 years of mateship. 100 years in which we have fought alongside you in every significant conflict, forging unbreakable trust through the act of defending each other's liberty and guarding each other's backs. We think of the personal bonds that were formed as 1 million American troops crossed our shores during World War II, and the layers upon layers of institutional ties that have been forged and strengthened since we sealed our alliance with the ANZUS Treaty of 1951. And in more recent times, in the skies over Syria, our combat pilots have fought together under the leadership of American commanders with the shared objective of defeating Islamist terrorism. We've been side by side in Afghanistan for 16 years, our longest military commitment. And in Marawi, in the southern Philippines, our forces provided game-changing support to the armed forces of the Philippines to subdue an ISIL-backed insurgency in that city. And every day, our intelligence agencies are demonstrating the deepest possible commitment to each other by sharing sensitive information, saving American and Australian lives. Just last year in Sydney, our intelligence agencies, our respective intelligence agencies and police, working with our friends in Israel, enabled us to disrupt an ISIL plot to bring down a passenger aircraft, an A380. Hundreds and hundreds of people would have died. I can tell you that our intelligence cooperation with the United States and other partners save lives right around the world where ISIL has had similarly dark intentions. That's what the alliance means today. It is a means for maximising our manoeuvrability and independence, not constraining it. Networks of personal trust, strengthened and expanded over generations, and all underpinned by the deepest possible alignment of shared political values. And this is the genius that really unites our two nations. We define our national identities, Australia and the United States. We define our national identities not by race or religion or ethnicity, but rather by a commitment to shared political values of freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, mutual respect. Patriotism is not tribalism or nationalistic chauvinism. It's not about demonstrations of power and prestige and subjugation, as George Orwell so brilliantly observed in 1945. True patriotism is a shared commitment to a way of life that is guaranteed by the institutions of democracy and the rule of law, institutions which are accessible to all, but as Governors Bullock and Sandoval and I were discussing earlier, rarer around the world than you might think. Now, since the Second World War, the United States has spread these liberal norms and principles to build an international system which has tempered the exercise of raw power and guided global cooperation. This remarkable system, which obliges nations big and small to play by those rules and to respect each other's sovereignty, has enabled our collective security and prosperity for the entire post-war period. The extension of the system after the Cold War ended has enabled the greatest burst of economic growth, innovation and human advancement the world has ever seen. Australia has supported, reinforced and occasionally led this process at every step of the way. But we know we cannot take any of it for granted. Our part of the Indo-Pacific region has enjoyed so much peace and prosperity for so long that there are some who forget that none of it would have been possible without the sheet anchor of American commitment and strategic power. And that commitment is as important now as it has ever been. American commitment has come at a cost, paid in blood and treasure. And we understand that the American people expect others to pull their weight, as we do and always have. My government is investing in the largest revitalisation of our armed forces in the air, on the land and on the sea, in the cybersphere, in peacetime history. Our defence spending is on track to reach 2% of GDP by 2020. And in these uncertain times, we should all be thinking about what more we might contribute. And we acknowledge the sense of frustration felt by many Americans that not all countries are contributing to efforts to reinforce and strengthen the open trading system that the United States has helped create for our collective benefit. We have no objections to WTO consistent enforcement actions against behaviour that flouts and thereby undermines agreed international trade rules. We want to work with you to improve the WTO and make it a more effective forum for driving trade reforms and ensuring full compliance with the rules. And we will maintain a dialogue on how our respective systems protect technologies and facilities integral to national security while ensuring our markets remain open and transparent. Now, the rules, the norms, the institutions that enable freedom, security and opportunity have been painfully difficult to build, but easy to break. Now, in Shangri-La, at the Shangri-La Dialogue, I should say, in Singapore last June, I warned that we cannot allow the framework of international law to be undermined. In November, I outlined an ambitious trade policy agenda and committed our nation unreservedly to the principles of open markets, economic freedom and the rules-based trading system. Now, we entirely understand and respect the President's decision to honour his election pledge to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But Prime Minister Abe of Japan and I were determined to keep that project alive. And the TPP-11 will be signed next month in Chile. We do not expect the United States to return to the TPP anytime soon. But by keeping this important trade pact on foot, we have created a live option which would otherwise not exist for a negotiated US return in the future, a possibility which the President himself has referred to. Late last year, my government released a foreign policy white paper which commits us to a far more active role in shaping the future of our region. We'll work with all our partners and friends to promote an open, inclusive and prosperous Indo-Pacific in which the rights of all states are respected. And on December 7, I introduced into our Parliament far-reaching reforms to protect the integrity of our political processes from foreign interference. Now, whether it is terrorism, transnational crime or foreign interference, the primary responsibility of governments, all our governments, is to secure the safety of our people and our way of life. Security and freedom are frequently presented as binary opposites, as if there exists a universe in which you could have one without the other. But these two principles are not mutually exclusive. They can be, in fact, they must be mutually reinforcing. The question is not what freedoms to forego for security, it's what security is required to enable our freedom. Maintaining our security ensures we do not have to close our borders to people, capital and ideas, but rather the very opposite. Maintaining our security allows us to sustain the enormous benefits that flow from our openness to the world. Now, our shared commitment to open markets, transparency and the rule of law has generated an enormous reservoir of trust between our businesses, consumers and regulators, and trust enables commerce to flourish. We like your movies, services and capital equipment so much that our bilateral trade accounts are tilted deeply in your favour. In fact, we haven't turned a bilateral trade surplus with the United States since President Truman, before I was born. Not that anybody's counting. American companies account for fully 1/4 of all foreign investment in Australia. They're contributing to the greatest job surge in our history, with 403,000 new jobs added last year in Australia. And it's a similar story on this side of the Pacific. We've just watched the US economy add 2.2 million jobs last year. Unemployment is as low as it's been since the year 2000. Around 180,000 American jobs are the result of Australian investment here. The BlueScope Steel Group, for example, employs around 3,000 people across the United States, while Austal, Australia's premier shipbuilder, employs over 4,000 Americans, and its investment is growing all the time. It was an honour yesterday and a symbol of our alliance when the President announced that the United States Navy would name a future littoral combat ship to be built at the Austal shipyard in Mobile, Alabama, the USS Canberra. The American and Australian economies are thus helping each other to thrive. And, you know, I always speak for all of the Australians when I say this, we find it impossible not to be constantly inspired by the restless energy of the American people. always reaffirming the power of optimism, resilience, and a relentless curiosity to find a new way and a new idea. And we both know that innovation is the key to productivity, which enables economic growth and more and better paid jobs. Innovation and science are key elements in our economic strategy. Your governor from North Dakota, of course, was until recently chairman of an outstanding global Australian technology business operating here in the United States and, of course, right around the world. So you understand that we have the same commitment to enterprise, but your example is always an inspiration to us. So many of the technologies that have transformed our lives, and so quickly, from GPS, social media, to the hyper platform that has enabled them all, the internet, were developed and commercialised here in the United States. Australia has made great contributions, and from Wi-Fi to the technology behind Google Maps, it's a long list. But the United States remains unrivaled when it comes to commercialisation and innovation. Pundits, of course, have been warning, are very fond of dire predictions, as you know, and they've been warning that the US is running out of oil for nearly 100 years. And yet, thanks to innovation in horizontal drilling and fracking and deep water exploration, US oil production has nearly doubled in the past 10. Now, I commend the NGA's focus under Governor Sandoval on the role that state governments can play in preparing the workforce for innovation and transformation. The signing of a Memorandum of Understanding between the National Governors Association and the Council for the Australian Federation, which is your counterpart, will deepen collaboration in this and other areas. New rounds of company tax cuts in both countries will lead to more investment, which in turn will mean more and better paid jobs. The IMF has lifted its global growth forecasts after the Trump administration cut the US company tax rate to 21%. And we cannot deny that the need to be competitive increases the urgency with which we are pursuing similar tax cuts in Australia. In Australia, we're presenting legislation to reduce tax for all businesses to 25%. We've already achieved a reform bringing tax down to, over time, to 25% for businesses with turnovers up to $50 million a year. That's not a huge business, I might add, at $50 million a year, but those businesses employ half of the private sector workforce in Australia. But we need to go further, as you have done. Now, the flow of investment in technology is not just one way, far from it. As you know, our $200 billion defence capability build is driving a new generation of Australian defence technology enterprises to integrate into the supply chains of US primes like Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman. We want the integration of our defence industry supply chains to match the interoperability of our armed forces. So I'm encouraged to see that Australian companies have been awarded over $1 billion in contracts to supply components for the worldwide strike fighter program, delivering 2,400 jobs. Those figures should double within 5 years. Our target is to become a top 10 defence industry exporter. Now, I know state and business leaders in this room are looking to leverage the Trump administration's commitment to infrastructure, and so are our business leaders. Clearly, our infrastructure companies thrive in the system of transparency and impartial rules that they enjoy in each other's countries. Companies like IFM in Indiana, Transurban in Virginia, Lend-Lease all across the United States. I'd like to see US and Australian infrastructure companies working together in other countries too, in places like Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, where there is enormous need for high-quality bridges, highways, ports, rail and telecom. For this to work, however, we need to get on with the post-war project of shaping an environment in which the most competitive and rule-abiding companies can succeed. We all know that investing in smart infrastructure projects can drive a regional economy. A bridge to a port, which connects to hundreds of other ports, creates much more than the sum of its parts. And in many cases, government backing will be vital. A good example is our recent commitment to build an undersea telecommunications cable which will ensure connectivity and bring new opportunities for our neighbours in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Our vision is for a single, inclusive, free trade zone of the Indo-Pacific. a region integrated under a common set of rules and norms that connect us all to one another and which will drive growth and job creation. It's vital that strategic competition does not create rival economic blocs. We look forward to partnering with all countries, including the United States, Japan and China, on those infrastructure projects that meet the criteria of transparency, fairness, accountability and market need. That's also how we constrain large states from imposing arbitrary barriers and engaging in economic coercion against the small. Security and prosperity, they go hand in hand. But we need to shape the rules that are necessary to make this happen. We need to level the playing field for private sector companies, update the rules of the digital world and ensure greater transparency and stronger rule of law in a world which is often short of both. And that's why, as I said, we've backed the Trans-Pacific Partnership so strongly, not just because of the market access it delivers, which is very beneficial, creates jobs and investment in Australia, but because it creates the rules of the road we need to match the economic journey we're embarking on. Now, governors, honoured guests, it's been all too easy for the rest of the world to take America's exceptional contribution for granted. If your long and hotly contested debates have prompted partners around the world to take greater responsibility for their security and prosperity, then they've served a useful purpose. I know it's fashionable to call the passing of American leadership and condemn democracy to a fate of inexorable decline. But let me tell you, that's not what I'm hearing from our trusted partners in our part of the world. And nor is it what the Trump administration is engraving into its most important policy statements. Your national security strategy, with its organising doctrine of principled realism, is a manifesto for upgrading a liberal rules-based system, not breaking it. Your national defence strategy signals a reinvestment in American hard power and the alliance system which amplifies its reach. President Trump's nomination of Admiral Harry Harris as ambassador to Australia underscores this message. American leadership in the world is in our interests, but it is in yours too. I stand with generations of American leaders who've seen its global alliance network not as a burden but as a force multiplier that first and foremost has enabled American prosperity and security. As President Trump himself reminded us, America first does not mean America alone. Now, so much has changed in the last century, in the last 100 years of mateship. We are, after all, living at a time when the pace and scale of change is without precedent. And I don't doubt that this will continue for the next century. But our alliance, our partnership, our mateship, whether it is a century ago or a century hence, will remain built on a foundation of shared values, which are timeless but never more timely. Values as Australian as they are American: freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and the spirit of enterprise which they enable. Thank you very much.